The opening chapters of the book of Proverbs are really completely different from what we generally think of as sort of that collection of proverbial sayings. Chapters 1 through 9 is it's almost narrative-like. It has a narrator, at least, and the narrator is wisdom herself, or at least for some part of it. We have characters. We have wisdom. We have whatever the female figure that characterizes the opposite of wisdom. But it also has many of the same features. It has address to children. What is it? Is it just a different genre? Is it a different text from a different period that's been added later? Is it earlier? What's the relationship between those?
Yeah, most people figure that it is from a later period. Now, if this literature developed in a nice logical way, and of course there's no guarantee that it did, but if it did, you can imagine you start out collecting sayings, then you have the people who collect them add their opinions to it, and then eventually they work up to longer compositions. But of course, you get longer compositions like this in Egypt at a much earlier time. So I think the dating of all of this is very, very tenuous. It's often assumed that this comes from the post-exilic period. There's no guarantee of that.
It does have a somewhat Greek character to it. And maybe that's just because we often think of wisdom as sort of Sophia, right? The character, the figure of wisdom in those Greek terms. How does this womanly figure of wisdom emerge?
Actually, I don't think it's Greek. Now, Michael Fox, who is one of the great scholars of this literature, tries actually to find a reference to Sophia in it. But the best analogies, I think, are to Near Eastern goddesses. The best analogy probably of all is the goddess Isis from Egypt. Now, there are closer connections with Ben Sira later on, and it's the aretalogies of Isis are speeches in which Isis praises herself. Now, that's the great oddity, I think, of a speech like the one we have in chapter 8. Now, you start out, doesn't wisdom call, but now, how is this to be understood? Once she gets into it, she will, in effect, praise herself. Right. And that's what Isis does too. So, you have one school of thought that thinks there was a goddess, wisdom. The goddess of the scribal schools. Problem is, we have no reference anywhere to anybody worshipping.
Right.
So, another theory is this is the wisdom of God personified. Well, this could very well be. This happens. You get attributes of gods that are personified. Now, she's always personified as a woman. And this may be just an accident of grammar.
I was about to say, how much of that has to do with the fact that the word for wisdom in Hebrew, chokhmah, is just feminine by definition?
Probably.
Yeah.
Probably. And then, as we'll see, they feel the need to balance that by putting in some negative female figures as a counterweight.
Yeah.
But now, when you start off in chapter 8, which is really the key passage on this, does not wisdom call, does not understanding raise her voice? On the heights beside the way, at the crossroads she takes her stand, beside the gate in front of the town, at the entrance of the portals she cries out, to you, O people, I call, O simple ones, learn prudence, and then take my instruction instead of silver, and knowledge instead of choice gold.
Yeah, there's the first chapters often don't actually contain much actual wisdom. What they contain is, the wisdom they contain isn't wisdom good?
It is. Now, what this suggests to me, and it's purely speculative, is that teachers sometimes went out looking for pupils. Now, we know this happened in Greece with the sophists. Hang around the gymnasium and pick up, one way or another, bright young students. An old tradition. Now, here they don't have a gymnasium, so where do you go? What's your most public forum? It's the beside the gates in front of the town.
Right.
And so it's not wisdom that's calling out here, it's teachers who are looking for pupils. And when they say, take my instruction instead of silver,
What they mean is, I'll take your silver, you take
you
my
take
instruction.
my instruction.
So when we have, though, when we have this personified figure of wisdom who praises herself, surely the thing that is most striking in that section is where she says, "Wasn't I there at creation?"
Indeed, and this is a very interesting passage. In 8:22, now reading from the NRSV, the Lord created me at the beginning of his work. Now the Hebrew verb there is kana, and if you look it up in a dictionary, they will give you create as one of the meanings of it, but the more typical meaning is acquire. Mm-hmm. And if you were to translate this, the Lord acquired me at the beginning of his ways, it puts a whole different cast on it, because it means that wisdom isn't just an attribute of God. Wisdom is something that exists independently.
And this, of course, is where at least early Jewish interpreters sort of got their idea that wisdom existed prior to creation, right? So
Yes.
if you look at a number of ancient Jewish texts, you'll see they go through lists of the 8 things, the 9 things, the 10 things that existed prior to God, to creation. The Torah, but wisdom is always among them. And my sense is this is the verse that sparked that entire idea.
Absolutely, and it's unequivocal that wisdom exists before creation. What's disputed, I think, is whether wisdom existed independently of God, something that God has to find. Now, in support of that reading of it, we have the poem in Job 28, which we'll probably come back to again when we talk about Job, but where is wisdom to be found? And in Job 28, no human being knows the way to it, but God alone knows the way to it. But that isn't suggesting that it was God who created it, actually.
Yeah.
Now, if you think of it as something independent of God, then wisdom, in effect, becomes a quasi-divine element that is there. It's not quite personal. It can be personified, but it's more an attribute that you can acquire, and it's spread throughout the universe.
Right. Again, it is more. It becomes more akin to sort of natural law, right? It doesn't require revelation. It's, as you said, it's accessible to anybody, Job notwithstanding. But that would seem to be the idea here, right? Is that wisdom herself, having existed since before the world, looking to spread her wisdom everywhere, anybody can come pick this up, right? It's inherent in the created order, right? I think that's so much of what's at stake here in invoking wisdom and creation at the same time.
Now, I think this is probably as close as the Hebrew Bible ever gets to philosophy. Now, I wouldn't quite call it philosophy, but something like this was at the root of Stoic philosophy, where they also had the idea of a spirit, sometimes called the logos, spread or reason, spread through the world. Then if you acquire wisdom, you see you're getting a little bit of the divine inside you. You can be transformed. And it's a view of divinity that you can participate in, which is very different from what you have in most of the Hebrew Bible.
At the same time, though, alongside wisdom, and we mentioned this already a couple of times, alongside wisdom is the other female figure.
Yeah.
Right, so sort of tempting, all standing in the same public spaces, right? Tempting the young men.
Yes.
But with holding out folly.
Yeah.
Right. Does she also exist before creation?
Well, she's maybe what co-evil with. No, yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't think you have the same Well, they don't make any statements.
Right. It's not built up in the same way, but
yeah.
these chapters really do put these two figures, these two female figures, sort of confronting each other.
And, they are, so to speak, principles of the universe, principles of life. This is not a matter of getting commandments from God. Now, two things probably we should talk about here with them. One of them is, she will say, he who obeys me will get life. Now, it seems clear enough from the book of Proverbs, they didn't mean eternal life. They didn't expect anybody to live forever.
Right.
Life is...
Nor were they thinking eschatologically, as far as I can tell.
Right, I don't think so. So I think, life here means about being good standing with God, something like that. Mm-hmm. And death is be on the outs.
Right.
And this is quite metaphorical.
Yeah. It's there's again it speaks to the sense of sort of life as good life, rewarded, right? There's a sense of satisfaction, and you get the things you're looking for. Yes, it's the kind of the death that's talked about here is the kind of death that I think you see in some of the Psalms, right, where somebody says, I have died, I'm in the pit, I'm in Sheol, but they're still talking, so clearly not completely.
Not quite dead. Right. The other issue is, how does this relate to the Torah? Because it's in these chapters of Proverbs that you get language that sounds a lot like Deuteronomy some of the time. My child, keep your father's commandment. Do not forsake your mother's teaching, and teaching there is Torah. And there is a school of thought, and I think this would be true of Jewish tradition later on, that would assume that this is referring to the Torah with a capital T.
Yeah. Hard though when your mother's Torah. It's tough to turn that into the Torah. I mean, this is, as you say, a Torah means instruction. It's just it is often a generic in this sense, but it's for later traditions obviously an easy way to say, right, look, there's a relationship between obedience to the law, and wisdom, right? This is the universal wisdom is obeying the law.
And I think later on also the law gets assimilated to wisdom. Sure. So that in effect, it's tradition that you're deferring to.
Right. I think you see that. I think in Psalm 119, right, in some of the later material where they do seem to be really playing with sort of law and wisdom as identical rather than as separate kinds of categories.
But one of the interesting things about these chapters is that about all of the book of Proverbs and all the wisdom literature before Ben Sira, all the stuff in the Hebrew Bible at least, is that it's a form of instruction that does not depend on the Torah of Moses. Right. And this seems to have been legitimate. It was an educational tradition in its own right, so to speak. It's not adverse to the Torah of Moses. It can be quite compatible with it.
Right, but it's hard to imagine. I mean, the difference is you could never learn the Torah of Moses from going in and observing a bee.
That's true.
Right, and that's really what this is about. I mean, that's what Proverbs. This is the whole notion of Proverbs and creation, and Proverbs in the sort of the created world is. You can learn so much of this just from paying attention and taking the lessons that the world has to offer you. I don't think you could learn the kosher laws from observing, the diligence of the ant, right? And I think that's I think one of the major distinctions.